Do people still do this? Do people still put like band patches on hoodies like this? This was like the coolest thing in like the early 2000s. This is how you knew you were on like the cutting edge of metalhead fashion. Hello everyone. It's me, Emma, the heavy metal lawyer who just fucked up her hair. It's time to do another breakdown of an extreme metal subgenre. I've been gone for some time because work is hell. But I am back. Last time I covered black metal, broke down all the black metal subgenres, and today I will be breaking down the infamous, the unrelenting death metal. Death metal was the evolution of metal to a new extreme following early black metal, thrash metal, and grindcore. Thrash metal and grindcore both had pushed the boundaries by primarily focusing on speed above all else. But within these subgenres, there were hints of other ways to push the boundaries, most importantly, the imagery and sound of Slayer. Slayer was more abrasive than the other members of the Big Four of United States thrash metal. The guitars shrieked, the drums were more cacophonous than the machine gun drumming that you hear in most thrash music, and the songs were about Satan, hell, and evil. But while Slayer's Reign in Blood was undeniably a major influence on the development of death metal, the first death metal actually preceded it, specifically Death by Metal by Mantis, who would later become the band Death, and Death Metal by The Possessed. Both of these are demos that were released by these two founders of death metal in 1984. Death metal was deeper than thrash metal in addition to being more extreme. Both the down-tuned guitars, especially when played with palm muting, and the growled vocals, which would expand into other kinds of deep, extreme vocals like pig squeals. It was a lot more extreme in form as well, abandoning typical melodies and song structures, even in the less technical forms of the genre. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Our first subgenre of death metal is brutal death metal. This is probably one of the worst and most vaguely defined of the extreme metal subgenres, even though it is one of the favorites of the extreme metal subgenres. The go-to definitions of brutal death metal generally explain that it is death metal focused on taking the most savage aspects of death metal to the next level, particularly by making the guitar parts more chunky, the infamous and making the vocals as guttural as possible. For someone new to death metal, the difference between, say, Death, a death metal band, or some people would call them a technical death metal band, and Cannibal Corpse, a brutal death metal band, it may seem indiscernible if you're not more familiar with death metal, and it certainly is not helped by the fact that fans apply it inconsistently. The usually helpful website Every Noise at Once has a genre map for brutal death metal that is a complete mess, featuring bands like Atheist, which someone like me would definitely not call brutal death metal. I think this is mainly due to the fact that brutal is the go-to complement for death metal music in general. Someone might describe a breakdown, a guitar riff, or a scream as brutal based on it being savage, as you would with the subgenre brutal death metal, or based on it being technically impressive or just enjoyable generally. That's why I don't personally use this subgenre very much as a subgenre, despite the fact that it does have this very particular definition that has been used historically to describe bands like Cannibal Corpse. Critics, musicians, and the industry in general can try their best to coin subgenres, and attempts to have a genre name used. But at the end of the day, the ultimate arbiter is going to be what the fans are actually using. If you want to know what old heads and nerds mean, though, when they talk about brutal death metal as a subgenre, there are few better places to start than the album Effigy of the Forgotten by Suffocation. And next we have industrial death metal. The various industrial cross genres can get a bit murky and gray because industrial itself has always had one foot in metal, so talking about any kind of industrial metal is somewhat redundant. Similarly, after bands like Slipknot and more recently Code Orange and Vane subsumed the electronic sounds of industrial into their respective versions of hardcore and metal, the lines have blurred even further. Speaking of which, when it comes to a band like Slipknot, there's at least a plausible argument that the subgenre of nu metal itself is a kind of industrial death metal. It's not just Slipknot either. Many industrial death metal bands are defined more often as nu metal than industrial death metal. That being said, I do think industrial death metal has a place as a subgenre, particularly because nu metal is not really a subgenre at the end of the day. After all, System of a Down is considered nu metal, but definitely is not industrial in any way. And same thing with Limp Bizkit is considered nu metal, and they're not industrial anyway. Rather, nu metal is more of a description of an era of metal that included things that you would call industrial death metal, as well as metal that adopted influences from hip-hop, for example, as Limp Bizkit did. To avoid any ambiguity, your start with exploring this subgenre should be with the most undoubtedly, unarguably industrial death metal band, so take a listen to Soul of a New Machine by Fear Factory. I actually like Demanufacture by Fear Factory more, but that album is further away from their death metal origins and sound, and some argue it's far enough away to not be industrial death metal and to be nu metal or alternative metal or whatever the fuck you want to call it. So let's just stick with Soul of a New Machine, because that's the one that every metalhead seems to be able to agree on as industrial death metal. So next up is melodic death metal. I love metal. Shocking, I know. And one of the reasons why I love it so much is the genre's iconoclast attitude is conducive to experimentation with music, especially experimentation that seems counterintuitive. Death metal was a move away from what melodies had remained in thrash metal, which in turn had been its own move away from the melodies of the new wave of British heavy metal. So a newcomer to death metal could be forgiven for hearing the name melodic death metal and thinking, wait, did they just go back to thrash metal? Melodic death metal is all about creating melody through polyphony. Polyphony literally means more than one voice, and you're probably most familiar with the kind of polyphony called harmonization, generally accomplished by having the multiple voices do the same part, but on different scales, though usually in the same key. Harmonization is one way that melody is created in melodic death metal, but I think this stuff is illustrated best through example. So let me cut to the chase and say the album I think you should use as your introduction to melodic death metal is Soundtrack to Your Escape by In Flames. And not just because I listened to it a lot when I was a teenager, though that's a big reason. Take a listen to the track In Search for I. The introduction features harmonization of two guitar parts, a pretty simple harmonization because they're actually playing on the same scale, just in different octaves. However, harmonization is not the only kind of polyphony, and a form of polyphony that melodic death metal also loves to use is contrapuntal polyphony. Unlike harmonization, where the two or more voices are performing the same part rhythmically, contrapuntal polyphony has the two or more voices performing different parts rhythmically that create melody through their interactions at different uniting points in their respective parts, which is where the term contrapuntal comes from, the Latin punctus contra punctum, meaning point against point. So, returning to Soundtrack to Your Escape, take a listen to The Quiet Place. There are three voices here at the intro. It's a synthesizer, a guitar, and another guitar. While guitar 1 has some little flourishes, for the most part, it is playing the same part as the synthesizer, just tremolo picked instead of sustained and 1 octave higher. That's basically harmonization like what we saw in the last song. But there is contrapuntal polyphony between guitar 2 and the synthesizer / guitar 1. The two parts have no melodic interaction the first measure at all that they're playing together. Guitar 2 plays A sharp, C, C sharp, C, whereas the synth and guitar 1 play B and F. But in the second measure, guitar 2 plays the same chord in 16th notes the entire measure, just F sharp over and over again. The guitar 1 and synthesizer starts with B again, but this time goes up a half step previous to what they played before in the previous measure, going up to F sharp to have that moment of point against point with the other guitar. The three voices all performing F sharp together in their different respective riffs. If you stripped away the synth and guitar 1, the intro would not sound very melodic, just standard down-tuned bar chords you'd hear in practically all death metal. It is by using some of the oldest techniques in human music history for creating melody, polyphony, that melodic death metal is able to put the melodic into death metal. So the next subgenre is slam death metal. I talked about the history of slam death metal pretty extensively in my video on the album A Blood Clot Ejaculation by the Dark Prison Massacre. And this video is already going to be really long, so I'll just refer you to that video for the details of slam death metal, a subgenre of death metal essentially tailor-made for slam dancing, using the chunky down-tuned guitars to create grooves you can go crazy in the pit to. Much slower and much more utilitarian in a way. And my personal favorite slam death metal album that I think is a great introduction to the genre is the album Ingesting Putridity by Visceral Disgorge. It's got a fucking awesome album cover, too. The next subgenre is symphonic death metal. So that contrapuntal polyphony I was talking about in regards to melodic death metal, it was and continues to be a favorite technique of composers of symphony music, especially in the Baroque era. It makes sense. Instruments as different as the bassoon and the violin are literally not capable of playing the same parts. So if you want to create melodies, you either have to make some instruments play very boring parts to achieve the harmonization, such as the infamous 4 notes that the cello plays for the entirety of Pachelbel's canon, or you employ contrapuntal polyphony. In the words of the vocalist of death metal band Macabre, death metal is basically bastardized classical music. So it isn't surprising that the experiments of bands like In Flames in the early 1990s with bringing melody into death metal through polyphony were followed by other death metal bands taking it a step further and combining symphonic music itself with death metal. None of these projects was ambitious or as successful as the combination of 80 instrumentalists, and 32 singers in the album Communion by Septic Flesh, which is where you should start for the subgenre. And the next subgenre is war metal. Outside of Black Sabbath and Motorhead, few bands have been as influential in metal as Sepultura in Brazil. They get the most props for their successful albums in the 90s, Arise, Chaos AD, and Roots, which are all just amazing albums, like metal essentials, and had such an influence on subgenres of metal like thrash metal, death metal, and folk metal. But sometimes their early albums are overlooked despite the fact that they were foundational to a whole subgenre of death metal called war metal, particularly the legacy of the album Bestial Devastation lives on, with a frequent descriptor of bestial itself assigned to war metal bands that are ferocious enough to earn a place in the subgenre. War metal earned its name from both its lyrical focus on and musical imitation of war, chaos, and massacres, and so on by mixing the most wretched elements of black metal and death metal together. And while it certainly wouldn't hurt to start with the first Sepultura albums because they're amazing, the album I'm going to recommend to introduce yourself to war metal is Asterol Awalin, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, by the band Impiety out of Singapore. I mean, just look at this album cover. That is peak war metal itself. The next subgenre I'm going to cover is death grind. Grindcore could have wound up fading into obscurity, in which case I don't know what I would have done with myself. The earliest grindcore, Napalm Death, Extreme Noise Terror, and Sore Throat, appealed to a very niche audience, the UK crust punk scene. Fortunately, death metal and grindcore formed this mutually beneficial relationship, like the fungus that forms in the roots of trees, with labels like Earache Records supporting both subgenres and bands like Napalm Death and Carcass merging the two subgenres together into death grind. Death grind is about liberating the best aspects of grindcore from the narrow confines that the genre can be put in. No need to make every song a micro song. No need for blast beats the entire song, and so on and so forth. Death grind allows bands to essentially play both genres, play both grindcore parts and death metal parts, sometimes different parts in the same song, sometimes in different songs entirely. There are albums like Utopia Banished by Napalm Death, and I discussed this at length in my Napalm Death tier list video. The flexibility makes it possible to allow for structuring albums to not sound monotonous or overbearing in the way that some less well-written death metal or grindcore sounds. You can sort of go back and forth between playing more towards grindcore, more towards death metal, to vary up the sound, the rhythm, and so on and so forth. And an all-too-overlooked classic in this subgenre that I think makes a perfect introduction to death grind is Bride of Insect by Nuclear Death, released in 1990. The next subgenre is deathcore. Rooted in New York takes on death metal but born as a scene in Arizona, deathcore sometimes feels like the red-headed stepchild of death metal. Death metal generally prides itself on being technically complex, particularly in how that complexity sets it apart from mainstream popular music. If you're not a musician, you may think complexity just refers to how difficult each part is to play, but particularly with death metal, the complexity often arises from the fact that the songs do not have a pop music verse, chorus, breakdown, chorus song structure, meaning the musicians have to play anywhere from 5 to 10 or more parts in a single song. So while deathcore has a lot of technically complicated parts, particularly with lots and lots of guitar sweeping, the subgenre tends to employ traditional popular music song structures more than the other death metal subgenres. That's not true across the board. Signs of the Swarm in particular departs a lot from traditional song structures. But as a general matter, deathcore is more likely to have traditional song structures than other subgenres of death metal. Unsurprisingly, that has made it more popular to mainstream audiences. The most popular deathcore band, Whitechapel, even debuted at number 10 on the US Billboard charts. Not 10 on the US Hard Rock Billboard charts, number 10 on the US Billboard charts, above Shakira and Lorde. But as a lover of popular music and a hater of pretentiousness, I think deathcore is overly hated on, and its blend of death metal sounds and techniques with more popular song structures not only can be good music in its own right, but also can introduce new audiences to death metal who might not otherwise brave music that was so different from what they typically listen to. And seeing that Cannibal Corpse, the archetypal brutal death metal band, is now going on tour with Whitechapel, the archetypal deathcore band, I hope that attitude has been changing. Anyways, my personal favorite deathcore album that I think is a great introduction to the subgenre is Here Comes the Kraken by Here Comes the Kraken out of Mexico City, which had a pretty big deathcore scene back in the day. I'm not sure how big it is nowadays, but it was huge when this album came out. And last, but certainly not least, is the subgenre death and roll. Some younger metal fans may be getting introduced to death and roll for the first time this year through the new Carcass album, Torn Arteries. I'll have a lot more to say about Torn Arteries during my roundup of the top 50 metal albums of 2021. Death and roll is exactly what it sounds like, the mixture of death metal with traditional rock and roll music. In particular, the mix usually consists of layering death metal style vocals and the down-tuned, heavily distorted guitars of death metal onto rock and roll music. For some reason, this subgenre doesn't get the hate that deathcore does for employing popular music song structures. I'm sure that has nothing to do with rock and roll being old man music, whereas deathcore was music by a bunch of kids with swoopy bangs. Anywho, death and roll came about due to Swedish death metal legends Entombed. Entombed is one of the most influential metal bands of all time, particularly because of their use of buzzsaw guitars, an extremely distorted guitar tone created by the mixture of two guitar pedals with the settings turned all the way up and the guitars tuned to drop B, which, if you're not a guitar player, that's a very low. As I talked about in my video on Entombed's first album, Left Hand Path, from the beginning there were some rock and roll influences in the music, especially in the drumming. But it was more of a flavoring of it on their first 4 albums than a whole new crossover subgenre. So there's only one album I can recommend, of course, to introduce you to death and roll, and that's Entombed's 5th album, my personal favorite album by them, To Ride, Shoot Straight, and Speak the Truth, aka the album that makes me wish I owned a motorcycle. So that's death metal. I want to give a big shout out to a book I've been reading that was very helpful for making this list. This is Death Metal Music by Natalie J. Purcell. Highly recommend if you're a death metal fan. It's got lots of interviews with musicians, including members of Dying Fetus, Incantation, and Necrophagia. Get it wherever books are sold. Let me know what your favorite death metal subgenre is in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more videos. My next subgenre deep dive will be on doom